just going to talk about user experience, otherwise known as, actually, it should be user experience slash UX, because UX is short for user experience. Um, well, it's actually UI is different. Yeah, UI is like I might talk about that. I might get more into that next week. I don't know. But yeah, UI is the interface, how you're going to interact with it. UX is uh, it's a little different. I think the example I saw was like UX, like so you have a product, right, is the apple, and then the UI is the knife, right, and then UX is the knife as it's cutting the apple. It's I don't know. That's the UI is the tool used to interact with the product. The UX is the action of actually doing what you're doing. That's yeah. Because I think some of the articles that are going to be posted up, I think that one of them has that example in there. But yeah, that's pretty much that's the gist of it. Uh, so for last, is there any questions from last week about JavaScript and jQuery? I know we went pretty quickly through it. Uh, Pretty much just basic programming. Yep.
I watched it online, but how are we going to be using that again?
That was that's it's optional for you to use. I had gone over it just because a lot of these like libraries, like the Bootstrap library and the Foundation library, there's actually to do some of the things in it, like to create like a dialog box or to create a pop-up window. You actually have to use JavaScript to get those things to work. And then I think by the end, I was really short on the end. I'll probably cover it next week. I went in, I talked very briefly about events. So like an event is when uh, it's you're waiting for something to happen, like on the page or in any program. It's event driven programming is when your program is waiting for something to happen. It doesn't actually execute until the event happens. So for example, like the click event, like you'll write some code, right? Code doesn't execute unless someone clicks on, say, the specific like button on the page, and then the code will execute and say it'll read something and display it or send something off. That's event-driven programming. Um,
Like the submit button.
the submit button, well, the submit, yep, submit button is also the same thing. Yeah, it'll send the data to the server. You can also have it. You do all sorts of events. Like you'd have it where when you resize the window, um, like the, because then you have different types of events too, and then the events you have an event handler, which is the code that runs and executes for the event. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll cover that next week. I'll have some examples next week on how that works. And next week we'll talk more about UI, and I'll have some examples of how that works, and get a better idea of how it's used. It's not a requirement for this class. This class is mostly focused on just the basics of like HTML and CSS. Throwing this in here on top of all that, just be too much. It'd probably be something covered more in depth in an advanced web class. Um, but is there any? You have any other questions? No. Any other questions? Yep. Uh huh. Yep. So yeah, just send me an email with your group members, and then I'll put it in a spreadsheet just to keep track for when you submit at the end of the semester for the final project. Uh, yes. Yep. Yeah. One person submit, and then I'll just group associate it with the group members for the project. Uh, no more than 3 in a group. So no more than 3. Any other questions? Okay. So the history of UX. So technically, user experience has been around for many years prior to the evolution of computer technology. I mean, it dates all the way back to the printing press times when you had newspaper articles, pamphlets, and whatnot. Just the way how things are positioned on the page, for example, um, is considered. So to get information, right? People will. I mean, I've seen examples where they go back to caveman times. We're not going to go back that far, but you get the idea. Usually, you have some sort of task that you need to complete, and you need a medium for you to do that. Uh, but with computers lately, I mean that's become the go-to thing now. People use computers all the time to do all sorts of things, such as reading an article, submitting some sort of information to say like a to the government. Let's say say you go to submit uh, tax returns now. You do that online. I know a lot of people will be doing that next couple of weeks if you haven't done so already. Um, so it encompasses many things. So UX refers to a person's emotions, attitudes about using a particular product, system, or service. And the user experience is going to be dynamic and it's constantly modified over time due to changing circumstances and advances in technology. So, for example, you have the printing press, right, which gives you the printed out pamphlets. Then television, prior to television, you had people acting out on stage, right? But then television came along, and now it's instead of having to go to a movie theater and waiting a certain time, now you can just watch a recording of it, pop it right up on your TV, and you're viewing the same exact content, but now it's a more friendlier, much easier thing to do. You don't have to schedule a time to go to it. You can just pop it up and view it however you please. And then you also have the personal computer, smartphones, etc. So here's an example here of just paper media. So on the left here we have a newspaper article, and you can see here, just the way that the article is set up. You have just like the way you see articles on the web. Uh, Nowadays, you have a picture, right, and then title for the article, and then the body of text. And usually, the way the text is laid out is the most important information is given first because most readers aren't going to read through the entire article. They're only going to read through the the first paragraph most likely. So usually when you structure these types of newspaper articles, you try to get the most pertinent information first, and then have the minutia details later on throughout the article. On the right here we have a typical W4 form, and on here you can see that the instructions are placed up at the top of the page in a consistent order. So first thing you want to do is read through the instructions, and then you go through and you fill out the information for your tax return, for your W4 withholdings as you go through this paper document. And you can see that there's instructions on each line on what to fill out, and all sorts of cues on how to put in this information. So then the next example we have is television. So television, I mean, it's evolved quite a bit. If you think about the early days, who remembers that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? A lot of people do. Think about on that show, I think at one point they introduced an app on the show, right, where you can actually interact and submit answers to questions that you thought, where you feel like you're playing the show, right? Another example, think about American Idol, right? American Idol, you're watching TV, right? And then they'll say, vote for such and such by texting to this phone number. That's that's a user experience there. Now you're interacting with the program in a way that originally you just wasn't possible without the smartphone technology. And then was that?
I must have been a peak in that like era. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you have to calculate the delay of the TVs,
Mm-hmm.
and then these people in that audience might have the app too.
Mm-hmm.
So
So yeah, it's a live event. I think they do it. They have you text it, and then it's like, yeah, they tally it up at the. But I think at some point though, they do show like such and such is up, or so they do like live stats, kind of like the election. Think about the general election. It's the same way because I don't know if I used to work with the county clerk's office. This was a huge problem, doing these elections every year because the election runs multiple times throughout the year. But one of the things that is an issue is that a lot of these places, where you go to vote, they may not necessarily have internet access at the location. So other places will, and you can receive the real-time voting data as it's coming through. But for the places that are, say, out in like rural areas, you're not going to be able to get that data until most likely the next day, where you have to. It's actually usually it's a cartridge. Take a cartridge, you walk it over to the office, plug the cartridge in, and then it downloads the data from the cartridge to the voting system, and then updates based on that. So I think in those circumstances too, they'll say they'll give you like a percentage of like how much that you have, like as the water fills up, how much is there. Um, so then another example too is with the UI experience with the television is now most set-top boxes they have built-in features where you can actually see, what program you're watching. Like so, you can you have like built-in guides now. You have buttons that you can hit that shows like the information about the program you're watching, when it came out, who directed it, who's acting in it, um, what episode you're watching, all sorts of stuff. And yeah, it's just an evolution of just how things. And I think in the future, eventually, television most likely will just go away for on-demand programming, via the internet. So it's interesting how a medium just morphs over time into something that it's unrecognizable at some point. Any questions so far? No.
Mom used to love those sending SMS thing,
Mm-hmm.
TV shows.
That-
Used to love the bill.
Well, that's another good example too. Just text messaging. Think about text messaging too. When text messaging first came out, right? It was just text that you sent. It was just, I think, and there was like a character limit on what could be sent.
140.
Well, yeah, 140. Yep, that's right. Yeah, because Twitter, when it first came out, you could text to a number, I think, and it would upload it to their website. But the thing about how that's evolved now, it's nobody uses just regular text anymore. They've got to send their videos, their photos, these animated like little cartoon characters dancing on the screen.
On the phones that could go on the internet, it was like
Uh huh.
I don't know how it connected, but it costed like $5 like per like web page, like when it would load. So like that's why like no one ever used it.
Uh huh.
I don't know if you ever remember that, like cell phones being able to do that.
Oh yeah. When they
It was
first
like, it was
came
like
out.
a weird phase, like no one used it, but it was able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Mhm.
like 5 minutes on your phone or whatever. So,
That's
now
true.
It's like so built in.
Yeah, now it's all. I think probably because it might be because it's standardized now. I don't know. It was probably using some sort of proprietary thing to do that, which may be why it was like cost prohibitive. But yeah, but now like that's another example of just basic text message. Now that's something that happened fairly quickly too. And they're talking about making a new SMS protocol that's going to be used between Google, Apple, the Microsoft phone. I don't know if people still use the Microsoft phone, but I think about iMessage. You can send payments. You can send money through the iMessage now,
Snapchat too.
and Snapchat and all these different messaging apps. That's another example of the just the way things like that change over time. So then you also have the personal computer. So you can just see here. I mean, this is just an example of just the Windows. This is the Windows tiles here versus the Mac control center, right? I mean, but they both accomplished. What's interesting here is they both accomplished really the same thing, but yeah, they have two. See, these would be the UIs here, right? So they both do the same thing, but they have a different tool, let's say, to accomplish the same type of task. So then let's start off. So starting from the first computer, right? When you had initially UX design for, back in the 80s, you were worrying more about the menus that you had in your text-based command programs. And you probably do something like this. How many people here again did like Java programming, or right? So when you wrote a program in Java, right? What did you have to at some point make some sort of like thing show up that said, hit 1 to do this?
We had like a menu.
Mm-hmm.
We made like a menu,
Mhm.
and it was like you could just like press different numbers for like what like, you wanted to order, and then it would give you like a price.
Mm-hmm. So think about that too. Just even number. So you have the menu, right? They had a display, and then on top of that, they go and they enter in, like, say, the price of a product, right? Say they put in 16. Did you also have to take into account what if they put in like an F or a D,
Like,
right?
Just like if it wasn't a number,
Mhm.
like, I think it was a end of the like, year project, but I
Mhm.
think we wrote our code so that it would be like you entered like an invalid number. It was just numbers 1 through 10.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Oh,
You can tell
okay,
it
yeah.
what the user enters something other than 1 through 10.
Oh, okay, yeah. And then you just have like a message, right, pop up saying, try again,
The
or
school,
yeah.
so the computer science division, they created like an IO
Uh
that
huh.
automatically did it for you. So
They.
program.
Okay, so yeah, they had like a class or something you inherit from, and yeah, so so that's something too, so that you didn't have to really even think about how to implement that, for the terminal there like that. But yeah, this is how it started out. It started out initially you had these terminal programs with, and they can get pretty complicated too. I've seen some where you had full blown, looked like that W4 form we saw at the beginning there. Where you had you'd have like some sort of text and then input you can put in here and whatnot. But yeah, so I started off with the terminal. Then eventually you had something called X window. How many people know about X window? It's essentially the first like windowing system for operating systems that came out, and really all it let you do was you could run essentially separate instances of this on one screen. So if you even look here, all you're seeing are really text-based. Even this is technically text-based operators here. This might have been, here might have been, I'm trying to remember what that's called, where you have the, probably had some sort of device drivers where you can actually go in and put in, basic graphics like that. But, it was really a text-driven interface that you had, but it allows you to have multiple windows up at the same time, so you no longer had to use something like Emacs or something where you're dividing up the window within one, text window here. You had this nice windowing system, and then that eventually evolved into this here, and then this came about with dedicated 2D, 3D graphics video cards. I mean, most of the time, initially it was more concerned about really giving you a display like this here, where you have, icons and, full color depth and whatnot. And then eventually, of course, they had to get all fancy with it, and they used it for other things like, making, 3D little, switcher taskbars here, and then you can see, then that, goes into your actual applications where you can have 3D games or CAD programs and whatnot. And then now today with UX design, we're trying to design websites that are, not only usable on, your desktop computer, but also on your tablet and your smartphone. And for that to work properly, you have to think about, just how you're going to do the same interaction on, say, something here that's using a mouse and keyboard versus a touch screen of a certain size, and then a smaller touch screen. How are you going to go about doing that same thing? So any questions on that? No? Okay. So we're going to talk about some usability guidelines. So these are some basic things. I mean, really, with UX, there's no like, it's just a bunch of people agreeing on stuff. There's no like set in stone rule of how these things should work, but usually you just go by the trends of what people are doing today and what people agree upon are good ways to interact with your product. So some guidelines that we have. So for example, dialog boxes should not contain relevant information because it diminishes the visibility of relevant information. Bless you. So what does that mean? Essentially, you don't want to have things cluttering up, dialog boxes for the sake of dialog boxes where it's covering up, things on your web page that are possibly more important. Information should appear in a logical order. Doesn't matter if it's in a dialog box or in some other portion of the page, because the information is communicated using words and concepts that are familiar to the user. So you should consider the following to keep the user interface simple and focused. So you should place commands for critical features or prominent areas such as a menu. So like, say, most of the time when you see like a program, you'll see like the file menu, right? Or the home button. A lot of sites will have a home button just so you can go back to, the original, your main page for browsing to other sub-menu items, right? Advanced and less frequently used commands should be placed in areas that are set aside somewhere, right? Less prominent areas. So, something like your settings, right? Your settings button, usually that's placed off to the right somewhere. It's usually like a tiny little cog that you see. And then you should also avoid placing commands redundantly. Instructions for using an application are visible or easily accessible whenever appropriate. Avoid complicated instructions. When appropriate, same user action is consistently used to complete the same application operation. And consistency is applied to visual presentation information, placement of user interface elements, format, capitalization, punctuation. Pretty much it's just, you don't want to have text out there that, you have a sentence put in and you're not using proper grammar, like not capitalizing the first word in the sentence, putting random capital letters in the instructions. Just basic common sense there. And you also want to avoid visual noise in the interface because it distracts users from completing a task. So visual noise is, that could be created by misaligned controls or redundant borders, neighboring controls. Another thing that you should do is give appropriate feedback when something, this is if you're doing, server-side coding, when there's going to be, I think we've talked about this before, when you have an operation that's going to take a long time. So when you have something that's taking a long time, you should have some sort of progress bar, maybe like a spinner wheel where you change the icon to say like an hourglass, just to signify that something is happening instead of just leaving the user to guess at what's going on. If you do have error messages, they should explain what the problem is and contain some sort of meaningful suggestions to resolve the problem. And whenever possible, your application should prevent errors from occurring. So for example, if you had a form that requires, say, a birth date or some other fields, you should signify that somehow. Usually people will have like a red asterisk next to it or have something that says required in the field itself. And then if they do submit without filling in the field, there should be some sort of prompt letting the user know. So here's an example here what we're talking about with that, so you can see this probably happens, user probably submitted this form without filling in some of these items here. You can see that the items that weren't filled in that were required are highlighted in red, and then there's also an explanation at the top of the page saying what the actual error is. There's 8 errors. You can see 8 errors prevented this registration from being submitted. Please correct any errors and indicate below. Try again. And then it actually lists each of the form elements that are required and gives a little explanation of what the fields are. I actually made a form, pretty lengthy form similar to this last year. Unfortunately, I can't show it because you have to actually log in as a real person, and it's going to show sensitive information such as where they live and their birth date, all that other stuff. But I had something where you would fill out the form and you would go to submit, and when it's submitted and you didn't have a certain section filled out, it actually scrolled to the last position where the field wasn't entered, so that you can actually go and enter in the appropriate form field without having to search through this massive list of questions on which item didn't go through. Any questions so far? Any of that? So this is accessibility. So another point is you should avoid using fixed font sizes and small font sizes just for readability, because something that looks readable, let's say on a desktop computer, may not be readable on a smaller format device such as a phone or a tablet. Should also, a lot of sites now allow you to actually change the font size and the actual time settings for like time zone and what. That's another thing to be aware of too, is just time zone, because you're the time zone on, say, the server that you're well, I guess it doesn't matter nowadays. Most of the time nowadays, I think people are hosting things in a either in a CDN or some sort of cloud service, and the web server time zone, usually the content being served up would be displayed within their region, so the time zone usually would be correct. But I think this was meant for back in the days when you were hosting your own web server. If I'm hosting something here in, I think this is New York time, right? And somebody in, say, China is viewing my website, you know, if I'm showing the time on my page, right? It's going to be showing the current, time in New York, not not in the area of China that they're in. So usually you have to take into account, the time zone that your users going to be in. And it also affects things too, like deadlines. So like um, when I worked on that application I was talking about, that was another thing that was a concern. Is if someone submitting an application and they're off studying abroad somewhere in another country, there's like a deadline of like say 11:59 p.m. And to specify Eastern Standard Time. I mean that was a crappy way of doing it, but it's just something that to keep in mind when you're serving these things up is that they're going to be in other areas of the globe. Should also ensure that user interface elements are clearly visible in low light settings, just so that they're easy to read without squinting. Ensure easy to read color combinations, group related objects on the screen, and ensure that the UI is predictable and that it's going to work on different display devices. So here's an example here that I found online. What are your comments on this user interface here? What's not friendly, right? What's wrong with it,
It's like cramped.
right? So there's one. So I just got a couple of. So one is that there's a lot of controls grouped together, right? Where it's you're just looking at it, just like, well, what goes where? Another point. There's no order, right, to anything.
A lot of that
You know-
stuff could have been a menu bar at the time. It could have been categorized.
This stuff here,
Yeah, they
Right.
could have put it as a menu bar, like maybe actions, and then had like
mm-hmm,
to click on one and then edit it or something.
right? So that was, I think we had said that, right? That was in one of the slides there, right, where stuff that's not important, right, that could have gone into say a menu item or a sub menu item, and had it display on demand, right, when it was needed. I mean, what does this do? Bulk rename utility.
Like, it's like renaming a bunch of files.
I guess it's renaming, yeah. So it looks like you have some regex. So I guess that's what's going on here. It's doing a bunch of regex combinations you can put in, but there's no reason for it to be this. Any other observations based on this this UI here? So this is something. I mean, this is even though this is an application, a Windows, most likely a Windows application. It also applies to a web page as well. I mean, a web page could just as easily look as cluttered as this interface right here. What's that?
It's like information overload.
Mm-hmm.
Too much information.
Right. And then even too, where would you, I guess, well, there's a help icon here, but something as complicated as this probably should be accentuated.
This might be like a separate point, but do you think it has to do with maybe how like people like in general have like shorter attention spans and like people are more engaged now, like than like back then? So like maybe like back then people could like look at all this and like they would look at it all, but now we don't. So like maybe like user interface or user experience is like evolved like, to match us.
Well, that's another good point. So it also focuses on, you have to focus on the audience too, right? Like who is this intended for that's going to be using this? So for example, I mean, yeah, even though, we're looking at it and it just looks like this jumbled mess. I mean, somebody who, this might be a good UI for someone that, does this sort of thing on a daily basis where, well, I can easily, get to my my regex expressions here and do my bitwise operators there, and so on and so forth. So that's also a good point, is to even keep in mind of the audience that your product, this is a product, your website's a product, is going to be used by. Yeah, because some audiences may find this design to be too complicated, and other ones may find it too simple.
I feel like every website or anything has evolved to becoming simple.
Because they want probably a broader audience to use their site, right? Because I mean, if it's a big turn off, if you go to a website and you can't figure out, within the first like 5 seconds of
But I think that
what to.
maybe, I don't know, maybe like 20 years ago, 10 years ago, people would spend the time like figuring it out.
That's true too. Well, and then the other thing too is, 10 years ago, the technology wasn't the same as what we have now. I mean, 10 years ago too, you can think about like the television, or the SMS. I guess is a better example. Like the SMS, right? It didn't have some of the features that you have in it now, and some of them make things a lot easier to do versus what it was 10 years ago. But yeah, that's a good observation there. Thank you. Any other observations? No? Okay. Here's another example. What's wrong with this example here? Well, so there's right off the bat, we have someone. What does it even say? So this is what we're talking about with colors. The proper selection of what colors to have. So you can see here. I mean,
Is this real?
this is. I believe it is. You can try. Yeah, go to that URL up there. I did a Google search on.
This looks too old to me.
You think like someone she knows, like, assuming she like they know.
It's
Well,
still on. She's
Would have
probably
said
paying. She's
something.
probably paying for the domain name of this fuzzy.
That's possible. I mean, so one of the things I just realized now is there's actually a menu. How many people recognize this menu item right here, right? So it looks like, yeah, this is a site for some sort of restaurant or a, I don't know, bakery or something. Or no, what is this?
It's a handmade clothing.
Oh, it's a clothing. Yeah, so
Just like hotter.
so so one of the things, right, is just the selection. I mean, right off the bat, the selection of colors just completely took away. Especially this background here. You have this background that is, multicolored and is just taken away from, the actual, like, say, the welcome text here. And even this text becomes hard to read. The actual pictures being used here, I mean, it's, it's condensed picture here with small text. And then even this menu item here. I mean, I didn't even see this until just now to even point out.
She changed her website because there's like, if you Google it, there's a lot of articles saying like worst website design ideas ever.
Oh, and this was.
But if you click on her actual website, it's like really nice now. It's like, it looks better.
Oh, there it is. See. All right, let's see here. I'll bring it up here. What was the website again?
There's like articles from like 5 years ago.
Mama Cheeses. Oh, mamascheeses.com.
Yeah, it's not the first link though. It's like mamascheeses.weebly.com.
Oh, did I spell that right? C-H-E. That C-H. Do I have an extra S? Like that?
It was 2 E's.
Oh, 2 E's.
Then
Okay.
there's
It's at
another one.
Weebly, right?
Yeah. There's a Google site.
What is it? W-I?
It's just .weebly. It's TEEBLY.com.
Weebly? Like that?
2 E's, a B, and then an L.
And there's also another S after cheesies, apparently.
Oh, just Google it.
Yeah, I'm just going to have to.
I think so, right? No?
What is it? Mama Cheeses.
Oh, maybe there's a space in between.
Yeah, you gotta put space.
She.
Wait, that's so
Why
weird.
does your
Maybe,
Google
like,
look different than mine?
Yeah, because it tailors it according to what you search. So like maybe I'm more likely to search for like this stuff.
Oh, that's something we can look into. But so bless you. So this is essentially what to keep in mind when this is what can easily go wrong just by not following even just some basic guidelines on yeah, I mean the picture there's there's the misalignment, picture's not centered, right? It's just it's a horrible, you look at it and you just get a headache looking at something like this. So moving on, so you also have user interface text guidelines. This is pretty much like instruction manual write-ups here. A lot of sites, you're going to have some sort of help section. And you also want to give some sort of visual cues as to how to use your website, because most of the time people don't want to look up instruction manuals. So because of the limited amount of screen space available on most devices, it's very important to minimize the amount of text that you have displayed to the user, as we saw in the last two slides. Most people do not have a lot of time to read large amounts of text to do a specific task. So when writing out UI text, you should ask yourself, is the user interface text clear, concise, and contextually relevant? So is it conveying the information on how to actually do something properly? Does the text consistently follow the style, terminology, and tone of the product? So that means essentially, are you using the same terminology throughout the site? Like, are you calling, using a term for, doing a specific task, using your product? Are you calling it something else later on? That could cause some confusion. And also, the text should follow localization and geopolitical guidelines. So, I mean, if you think about Facebook in China versus Facebook here, I'm sure is, very different, just based on the rules and regulations that they have over there. So you're going to have different. Your site's going to work differently just based on just that alone. And when I say localization really just means your site is translated into different languages like English, Spanish, German, Chinese, etc. So here's a checklist when coming up with your text for your product is to use clear terminology, avoid technical jargon, use as few words as possible without losing the meaning. So less is more. And then you also use one term consistently for all your concepts that have the same meaning. So try not to, use different synonyms for, the same thing, because like I said, it could cause some confusion later on down the line. Avoid negative and politically sensitive terms. Write active sentences. Do not use exclamation points. So when writing instructional text, present the result before the required action. So for example, if you're importing, to begin importing context, click next. So let the user know, what they're going to be doing when performing a certain action. Make sure UI command labels match labels for the UI that they open. So for example, if they click on the save button, it should, save the document, it shouldn't delete the document. So just make sure that the label matches the action that you have. And then a lot of times too, some organizations, you'll actually have your your UI text run through an editor or an approver. It's usually like an HR office usually does this. They usually review it for consistency and to make sure things match up with the guidelines of the organization. It's just like any other, usually too when you have like you're making a front page for a company, if you have a design for it, it usually has to be approved by the by some sort of editor before it goes through. And then you should also write informative error messages that give non-technical responses to the user. So, for example, if you get a 500 error, which is something seriously went wrong with your page, you can write something like something went wrong in processing the request. Support team member has been notified of the incident and will investigate the issue. And then this was an interesting one. Do not write content that implies the application can think or feel. I mean, that's debatable. Yeah, some people, they like to do the cute error messages now where, but like I said, it's a heuristic. It's, doesn't have to be, it's not something set in stone. So error and information messages, they should identify the problem and indicate the cause if helpful and provide a solution to the problem. So, for example, if, if the error was caused by some sort of, kernel corruption, it's not something you necessarily need to share with your end user. They're not going to understand what it means. It's something you'd probably have, kept in a log file anyway, so you can just tell them that, something went wrong and that there's no solution. It's not, to the issue, but we're going to look into it. You should write phrases instead of complete sentences to conserve space. And then, just basic stuff. Use title cap rules in the title bar. So that means just everything in caps. And then sentence cap rules in the message body, which is just basic, grammatical syntax. You should bold command names instead of using quotation marks. And then when there may be a consequence of a user's actions, you should preface the error message with some sort of warning. So, for example, warning, if you synchronize now, duplicate items may appear in your inbox. So you should give some sort of, just let them know that, something's going to happen if they do something, say, out of sequence, and what will be the consequences of that action. So here are some examples here. So I got like 5 different examples of error messages. Which one do you think is probably the worst error message here on the screen? Which one?
No.
The no?
Yeah. I never did.
Oh, this one here, right? Yeah, this was an interesting one. What's wrong with this error message here? So what? So you see, an error occurred, right? No, okay. So right off the bat, right? It just doesn't make
It's not like
textual sense, right? Was that?
it doesn't offer to help. Usually they offer to help, and like I don't ask, I don't use it anyways.
Yeah. So I mean, what's going to happen if I hit? What's the difference between hitting no or okay, right? In this circumstance, it's not like it's a different action's going to happen.
You feel better about it.
I don't accept this error.
Was that? I don't accept.
the error.
Yeah.
No.
And then there's also an X, if you notice too, up here. So it's
No is just to cancel.
was that?
No is for like cancel and
Maybe it's
okay.
like
It's
ignore.
Well,
you acknowledge.
I mean, first off, it's a kid's website.
well, it could be. Yeah, this could be. I don't know where. Like I said, I think a lot of these examples I just pulled off of Google Images, but usually too, like so. Yeah, for example, you have no and okay, right? Like what? So an error happened, right? When an error happens, there's really, the system's going to either attempt to recover from the error automatically, or there's just no recovery from it. So either way, what other user interaction, right, can you have in that circumstance? And if there is a user interaction that can be done to say, say discard your your results, it's not telling you, right, in this message here. It's just giving you a no or okay, which who knows what that, even what the difference is. Another thing too that could be observed is that you have usually when you have the yellow, you have a yellow and and a red button here. Usually the yellow usually goes with like a warning versus the red, which goes with an error. But usually you wouldn't have it in the buttons themselves. They'd usually be like in the actual message body here. So yeah, so I mean there's one example there. You also have the bad gateway, right? What's wrong with this message here? This. Well, yep. So it's given us the actual the actual that's good observation. It's given us the request code there, right, of the HTTP request. So a 502. Well, at least it's telling us what the 502 means. It's a bad gateway, right? But is this something that you need to present to the user, right? This is probably something that should be avoided. I mean, we're all um, School of Communication students, so most of us, and we already covered this. Most of us will know. Yeah, this means that a 500 error occurred, so there was an error with the request. But most people, they have no idea about HTTP requests and the difference between a 400 error versus a 500 error or a 300 error. So yeah, normally in this circumstance, yeah, this is going to be not helpful. Doesn't give us a way, right, to go. What about this one here? What are your observations about this error message here, the Airbnb error message? What's that?
It's colorful, but it's still as vague as the one above it. Right?
It's still yep, it's vague.
It gives you options to go back to other places.
That's yep. So that's important, right? So if we do have an error, it at least gives us a way to go back to what we were working on, right?
I don't think it displays the error code big enough.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah, the error code, yeah. So you have the 404, but like we said before, is that something that is necessary? I guess it's going to depend on the audience, right? Like, so most people, right, they're not going to know the difference between a 500 error versus a 400 error code.
I think seeing the grandma drop price makes me upset.
They have the grandma. So this is what I was talking about with the cutesy. So this is implying that there's some sort of emotion, right?
Yeah.
That the computer has feelings.
Makes me want
You can set that. Yeah, you can how to set like where error pages go directly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you do that through HTML. Right?
Oh, you can do that a few ways. Yes, you can. So for when you have, if it's a request like this, they're called. You can do what are called HT access. There's a few ways you can do it. You can do it in the application. You can have the application actually do a redirect when, say, the request comes up with a. Well, you can have the application catch the error. I think for when it comes back, when the web server is returning, this like 500 error, you can have it do what are called like, you can have an HT access file say that, if a 500 occurs, redirect to, the oops page here. And then it'll, it's really a static page, or it could be a dynamic page, could be like a PHP page, could be anything really. But yeah, I think, that would be HT access files. You see, it would be the .ht access, and then there's rules that you put in for when certain things happen. So yeah, that's the. So then you also have this page here, right? Gives you a little display prompt saying, you need to enter user account information. And then here's an example of something with consequence, right? So like, this person here cannot read the item, saying if refreshing the query will remove all the changes you made so far, do you want to continue, yes or no? So that gives you clear indication of what's going to happen, what are the consequences if you want to move forward with it. And that